Hi there, my name is Kelsey, and today we will be discussing the case of the Big Cypress Doe, also known as Mostly Harmless, Denim, or Ben Bilemy. So he was discovered in July of 2018, and he actually wasn't identified until this year, January of 2021. So this case has always been very fascinating to me. I definitely saw a little bit of parallel between the Chris McCandless case as well as the Lyle Stevick case, and I was inspired to come on YouTube and talk about it. So I know that there have been plenty of people, and I mean plenty of people who have already covered this case, especially while it was still a mystery, trying to get the word out to identify him. And it was really great to see a lot of communities coming together to get that information out there and eventually identify him. Web Sleuths was great. Reddit was really great in trying to get him identified, as well as the Facebook pages that were created. And, there were multiple news outlets that were reporting on this story, and eventually that circulation of the story is what got it in front of the right eyes for him to be identified by, people in his life. So it was really great to see that all coming together and seeing so much interest in this case. And especially within the hiking community, I think it really spotlighted how many people really cared about him and, what kind of impact that he had made on people out on the trail as well. So I was really interested to want to cover this case for that reason. There were a couple of videos that I watched. I did some independent research on my own as well, but I just wanted to give a couple shout outs before we get started. So John Lorden of the Lorden Arts channel, he is a phenomenal YouTuber. He consistently provides really great, thorough coverage on cases that he talks about, and I reference his video a lot in this research. But he always takes really great care in the cases that he covers, and I just absolutely adore him. So John Lorden is one that I reference a lot. I'll put a link down to his video down below as well. You should definitely check him out if you haven't already. Sherilyn Dale is another true crime YouTuber that I recently discovered after hearing about her channel on Gabulosis, her channel, and she's another true crime YouTuber as well. One thing I wanted to point out with that, so Sherilyn made a video before he was identified and then afterwards, and one thing that I thought was really great was that after he was identified, she waited until they can confirm and contact the family before making her video on the case and shedding a little more insight on what his personal life was like. Vance Rodriguez, leading up to and potentially kind of painting this picture of his mindset before he started on this thru hike. And I really respected that she wanted to wait until his identity was, announced to the family and that they were officially notified before she made her video, and I just have absolute respect for her in doing that. So I'll also link her videos down below as well, so you can check her channel out. Dark Curiosities also has a shorter video on this topic, and they helped fill in some gaps and led to some different areas of research as well. And then also the narrator has a beautiful accent, so that's always enjoyable. But they also cover a lot of cases and provide a lot of detail in a shorter format, but you kind of have a bit of variety amongst those different videos. So I'll post those below, as well as my own resources as well. But like I said, the hiking community coming together and, getting that information to authorities, I think did a lot to help this case. People were able to gather little bits and pieces of information that Vance had provided while he was out on the trails. I'm sure there's plenty of times where, little pieces of information come up that, most people wouldn't really think in conversation would help track somebody. but, you know, it seems insignificant at the time, but it eventually led to, you know, those areas being, you know, looked into, and eventually he was able to be identified from that. So it was really great to see the hiking community come together, and then, like I said, Reddit, Facebook, web sleuths, everybody kind of came together to try and solve this case, much like the Lyle Stevick case. And so I definitely see a lot of parallels between that, and then because of the circumstances of the case, there's also a lot of elements of the Chris McCandless case that I could see as well. And so I wanted to just, you know, kind of go over that. Another shout out I wanted to list as well, Nicholas Thompson. I believe he's the editor at Wired Magazine. He offered a lot of great insight in his article. I think he wrote a couple of articles, but, you know, there's one in particular that I'll link down below where he talked about, you know, his relationships with people in his life, you know, leading up to leaving it all behind. And I think that really helped paint a picture of where his mindset was at the time, and, you know, kind of the dynamics, the complicated dynamics that he left behind as well. And I think that really helps in trying to understand why people would just pick up and leave, or, you know, what they felt they may have to come back to or not come back to, right? So I think that is a really important part of the mystery of this whole case. But, you know, there was also a part in the article where Nicholas was saying he targeted the article that he'd written about, you know, Mostly Harmless at the time because he wasn't identified yet. And he tried to target it to specific areas, like in Baton Rouge, which is what ended up leading to a former coworker reaching out to authorities and identifying him. So it was just, you know, a huge effort on everybody's part, you know, the online community, reporters, you know, and then also Collier County, the sheriff's office that was dealing with this case. They also worked tirelessly for years to try and piece these things together to identify him. And they were also working on, you know, using genealogical information, you know, from DNA that they had obtained, I believe, from bone fragments, and, you know, isotope testing on his teeth to try and figure out who Mostly Harmless was. And it was a huge collaborative effort of everybody, and it's always really beautiful to see, like, the internet work in that way and bring these groups of people together in solving a case. So I was really interested to kind of see all these things come together, and was really excited to kind of get that resolved for the case, so his, you know, loved ones, his friends, his family, could have some kind of closure in that case. And then once those details started coming out, it became clear on, you know, why he may have wanted to take some space and, you know, have that alone time so he can, you know, kind of reset and potentially come back to everybody at the end of it, and, you know, possibly build better dynamics or just start fresh. So I thought it was really interesting to kind of hear these other sides of it, you know, while there is that part of the mystery that's solved and knowing who he is, you know, I think there is also something to be said about the mystery of the person behind the name, right? You know, the context matters a huge deal, and, you know, knowing the interpersonal dynamics that led up to this situation, I think really weigh heavily on this case, and I'm glad to see all those pieces come together. Like I said, I'll put my sources in the description box. So I wanted to start out with the facts of the case, and I do call them facts, although, I mean, this is just information that I believe to be true based on the resources that were available to me. Obviously, there's going to be multiple sides to the story, and there's going to be information that I'm not aware of, but, you know, if you guys do have other information on the case that I don't cover, I would love to hear it. You know, I'm always willing to kind of get more pieces together, and, you know, there are times where in research you overlook certain details that can kind of create a whole different narrative. And like I said, this is just based on information that was available to me. I would never knowingly spread false or misleading information with or without actual malice, is the legal term, where I would intentionally or recklessly disregard the truth, right? I don't want to spread misinformation. I want to try and present it in a way that, helps the case or helps gain a perspective or understanding of it. So, based on that information, these are the facts of the case that I believe to be true. So, Mostly Harmless was, or Big Cypress John Doe, was discovered by two hikers on the evening of July 23rd in 2018 at Noble's Camp in Big Cypress National Preserve, which is about 5 miles north of I-75 in Okeechobee, Florida. He didn't have his ID or a GPS or a cell phone, but he was carrying hiking supplies, food, water, about $3,600 in cash, a map of Florida, but no detailed trail maps, and he had a notebook full of handwritten code, which was, and some ideas for a strategy game for programmers called Screeps. He was completing a thru hike, which goes from the Appalachian Trail, connecting to a couple different other trails like the BMT, PT, ALR, FT, and then eventually down to the KER trail. So that's about 5 or 6 trails together, which kind of string along towards the Eastern Continental Divide, which can actually go all the way up to Canada. Many people consider the beginning of the Appalachian Trail, up towards Maine. I'm trying to think of the name of the actual city. Katahdin, Maine is where the Appalachian Trail officially starts, or I guess ends, depending on which way you're going. But Mostly Harmless had started his thru hike somewhere in New York in late spring or early summer. So I've heard different reports. Some people say that he started in April, some people say that he started in June. He wanted to complete the hike all the way to the southernmost divide of the U.S., which is located in Key West, Florida. But, he had started in New York. So some people say that he started in April, where there are reports of him being seen camping at the Bear Mountain State Park, which, he was camping there for about 2 weeks in April, but I believe that he actually went home after that before starting out in June. So there are a couple things that kind of point me to think that. So to give you guys a quick timeline of, Mostly Harmless, so in winter of 2016, Kay and Vance break up. She moves out of their Brooklyn apartment. In January of 2017, Vance/Bejor makes the Mostly Harmless comment on the Screeps Slack channel, reaches out to his college roommate Randall, who is concerned that he may choose to end his life. In, the months following that, he's making posts on that Screeps Slack channel until about April of 2017, where he makes his last comment on the Slack's channel. He goes out and camps at Bear Mountain State Park for about 2 weeks, possibly returns home. I do think that that's probably what happened, since rent was paid for about 2 more months after this, making that June start time a little bit more feasible. Otherwise, April to June, his time is pretty much unaccounted for. Was Bear Mountain a trial run for the Appalachian Trail, and he did well on it, so he decided to go ahead and go forward with it, or make adjustments to make that track work. So in June of 2017, Denim starts out on the Appalachian Trail somewhere in New York. He changes his trail name to Mostly Harmless about 2 weeks in, although some people still called him Denim later on in the later parts of his hike, so maybe he would switch back and forth, or he met the same people who had met him earlier in the hike, so that's how they knew him. It's hard to say. On July 28th, 2017, Mug Thumper and Reddit user I Hate This Part Too met Mostly Harmless at Raven Rock in Smithsburg, Maryland. Mostly Harmless had said that he was new to hiking and was spotted with a heavy pack, which, they had estimated to be between 50 to 60 pounds. He'd also said that he started in June, but was enjoying it so far. I Hate This Part Too said that he had talked to Mostly Harmless for about 20 minutes before heading in different directions, and he said that Mostly Harmless was having a blast and seemed to be in good health. In September of 2017, Obsidian, her name is Jennifer, snaps a photo of Mostly Harmless at the Mountain Home Hostel in Front Royal, Virginia, which is about 25 miles north of Pass Mountain. They had hiked over 100 miles together, so I'm really glad that, he was able to spend that time with them and have somebody with him for that stretch. They must have had a great connection to be able to hike for 100 miles. I couldn't even hike for like 5 miles with somebody unless I really liked them, and I'm glad that they had a really great connection and were able to, get to know each other a little better. Although she did say that she never got his name, but maybe that's what he wanted. He just wanted a little bit of company in the meantime, and they went their separate ways after that. But they must have had a great connection in the meantime, and I really love that for him, honestly. Reddit user Steelmaster J had met Mostly Harmless and Obsidian at the Pass Mountain Hut in Shenandoah National Park in Sperryville, Virginia. Obsidian had been hiking with Mostly Harmless for about 100 miles, but she said she didn't know his name but had already been in contact with authorities, providing the information that she knew. Web sleuths user Gardner1850 had posted an extensive timeline, including sightings of Denim, Mostly Harmless, Ben Bilemy, and compiled that information with physical descriptions and descriptions of his gear in order to try and get more information out there and try to jog people's memory that were hiking along that trail. So I got a lot of information from these particular sightings from there. I'll also post it in the description below. It's really extensive. They did a phenomenal job, and there was actually some information that other people had overlooked, and so I wanted to include that here as well. But there's way more sightings out there. Obviously it's a long trail. A lot of people hike it every year, so there were plenty of people who had seen him, even though there's only a couple that I listed here because they seemed important. So in September 27th, 2017, MJO had met Denim near Helvey's Mel Shelter in Bland, Virginia. On October 7th, KEV had met Denim while they stayed at the Woodchucks Hostel in Damascus, Virginia. They were there for a couple of days while they waited out a hurricane which had hit the trail. KEV said that Denim still had his pack, which weighed over 50 pounds, at that time. But the fact that he still had his pack, months later, and it's a heavy one too, shows that he was trekking along pretty fine and, was adapting well to it. When he had first started out on the hike, he had been seen wearing braces like on his knees and, started out in denim. So it sounds like, he was able to get a groove and still was able to have that, even months into it. In December of 2017, Mostly Harmless had registered at the Wallacey Interpretive Center, which is a man-made structure in Neels Gap, Georgia, on Blood Mountain. So that's where Mostly Harmless said that he worked in IT in New York City for about 10 years. I thought this was interesting because other hikers had said that he didn't really seem interested in logging in or out of the trail logs. So why did he choose to do this here? Is there any significance of this area to him? He grew up around Baton Rouge, so maybe he had been there with his family or something like that, and it was just a special nod to them, right? But when he was at the Wallacey Interpretive Center, he chose to log in there, and, I'm just curious if there was any significance there, and I hope that someday we get some of these answers. Wallacey is about 30 miles, 12 hours walking away from the Springer Mountain Shelter, where Reddit user Dark Bird is home, camped with Mostly Harmless at the Springer Mountain Shelter in Blue Ridge, Georgia, on the Appalachian Trail. In December, he said that they stayed up late talking for hours about a variety of subjects. They had a mutual love of sci-fi and fantasy, and they would even get into more personal topics like their family dynamics. They both grew up with abusive fathers, and he said that Vance was a neat guy with a great story, and he was really glad that he got to meet him, but he didn't get his name at the time. A user High Trailer replied to Dark Berta's Home's post, asking if he could remember any additional information about him. And he had said that, he looked up the name Mostly Harmless and discovered it was a reference to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And Dark Berta's Home had said that that made sense considering how much he loved sci-fi and fantasy, and that he had provided all the information that he could think of to authorities. But he did remember that, he had worked in IT in New York City, and he said that he didn't talk to his parents. He because of that relationship with his father was potentially abusive, and he mentioned an ex-girlfriend but didn't know her name. He thinks that he had his sister, but it was just, it had been months ago at that point, and he provided everything he could remember. But I'm really glad that he found somebody again that he really connected with. And he said that they talked for about 5 or 6 hours the first night and about 2 hours the second day. And I really love that for him, and for him to have a fast friend that he really connected with after being alone for probably a long stretch, if not most of his life. I think that it definitely left an impression on Darkbird, and I hope that it made a positive impact on Vance as well. This is the area where that GoPro footage was captured. Unfortunately, when they released the GoPro footage, you weren't really able to hear him, because he was just such a soft-spoken person over the person that recorded the GoPro footage. But it was at that area where that was captured. In January of 2018, that's where his landlord had got the warrant to enter his apartment, after not receiving rent for over 6 months. But by then he had been reaching the Pinhoti Trail in Alabama. He was already, so far along the way at this point. And Reddit user Hank Scorpio 1x1 met Mostly Harmless on the Pinhoti Trail. Mostly Harmless had told him that he had started hiking when he had started the Appalachian Trail, so he just got into it. And he said he was originally from Baton Rouge but lived in New York City, worked in IT. Hank had commented that they found code in his bag. Vance had mentioned that he was thinking of inventing a small, lightweight hiking gear that would track your hikes. Hank said that he didn't have a phone on him from what he could recall, and that Hank's friend had actually met him the next day while hiking, and his friend gave him information on how to get to the Florida Trail. And he said that he had reported all that information to the Collier County Sheriff. In February 22nd of 2018, Suzanne and Sugar Rush had hiked with Mostly Harmless for about 25 miles between the Osceola River and the Ring Dike campsites in Newport, Florida. After walking through a floody, mudded part of the trail, she had stated that she doesn't know how Vance had made it that far without a GPS or detailed maps, since they had had trouble navigating the rough and flooded trails, even with a GPS. Suzanne had said that, they exchanged trail information, going into careful detail, giving him as much information as they could to help him navigate the rougher terrain. John Lorden had said that he saw other sources stating that he didn't have a GPS, but he, had also seen pictures of him holding maps and printouts of Georgia. He was found with a map of Florida when, he was eventually discovered. But in terms of specific trail information, he didn't have that. And, it didn't seem like he, maybe he had them at the beginning of it, maybe he lost them. Maybe he did actually have a GPS, but he, felt like he had to say he didn't have one, or, maybe he just didn't disclose that information to other hikers. But, since he wasn't found with a GPS, I assume he didn't have one. And he probably enjoyed the challenge, knowing what we know about him. Did he think there would be more resources available as he went on? Or maybe he enjoyed having a reason to ask people for help. Maybe he was like, oh, I'll just ask these experienced hikers. where am I going? And I'm sure that's a nice part of it, is having that, commonality and a end goal in common. So I could see why he maybe didn't bother to get the more detailed information, or he just liked figuring it out on his own as much as he could. On February 24th of 2018, BV said that he met Mostly Harmless at Sand Pond Campground in Pine Log State Forest, and that's in Ebro, Florida. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. Mostly Harmless had told him that he was staying with his sister in Sarasota or Fort Myers and started in that area, which I thought was interesting because those are both south of that area. So he had said that he went backwards basically, or he started south and was going north, but he was north and went south. So I'm wondering if he decided to like switch that narrative because he like was looking or sounding ill and could maybe sense the concern that BV might have been giving him when he got that information that he was hiking over, 10 miles a day. It could have been that he said that to like make it seem like he hadn't been going that far, or that he had time to rest and really recoup when he probably didn't. Even if he had stayed with his sister, even if she was in Sarasota or Fort Myers, like that's pretty far south from where he was. So would he like go down there and then come back up, or was he just lying or grabbing at names he could think of and in that area? I'm not sure how familiar he was with Florida. I could maybe name a couple of cities, having spent a decent amount of time there. But maybe he was just he spit out Sarasota or Fort Myers, and thinking that that was closer than it was, or that the story made sense when in this situation it doesn't seem to, if he was going north and heading south. But he had also told BV that he had health problems and that he was trying to do this trip while he still could. So for me, this is the piece of information that I feel a lot of people overlooked, but I kind of picked up on and really kind of went with that. I think there is probably some truth to that. It could have been that he received some kind of diagnosis, in the time before he decided to prepare for this trip, and decided that he wanted to do this while he had the opportunity. Or it could have been that, as time went on, he felt more sick and hadn't seen a doctor. Maybe there were doctors available in these outposts along the trail where he got some kind of troubling information, or had started showing symptoms of, something seriously wrong, and he knew that. And so it was one of those things where, he wanted to finish while he could. Whether he knew that before he started, during the time that he was out on the trail, or, maybe he just made it up. I think that definitely can provide some context. And, it could have been that he just lied. Who knows? He's in his early 40s. He seemed to be in pretty good health. He was hiking over 10 miles a day. I'm not even in my 30s yet, and I can't even do that. So, he seemed like he was in really good health. And, for him to say that he was sick if he wasn't doesn't really make sense. So I think there probably was some truth to that. And then in March of 2018, AK had met Mostly Harmless near the Osceola River, which I'm assuming goes pretty far because there's a couple of people that mention Osceola River, and he had said that he planned to reach the southern terminus, which is the, southernmost point of the continental U.S., in Key West. He said he planned to reach that sometime in July. So it seems like he planned to see it through, and he was so close. He must have just ran out of steam, or maybe hit a wall, or possibly had a major outage that led him to becoming catatonic and not wanting to go on. And I think that's very unfortunate and sad in some ways that he was so close, but he didn't quite make it. He only had about 250 miles, and that's an estimation. I think it was actually less than that, because I had to use like the directions on this website called Old Nimble Will Nomad, where they give directions on how to get there to that buoy in Key West. But based on that to, where he was found at the Nobles camp, it was less than 250 miles, and he could have easily done that in, a couple of weeks if he was hiking like 10 miles a day. But I just thought that was very unfortunate that that part was left unfinished after going so far on his own. He, had been cited by a couple other hikers. Another hiker said that he appeared to be healthy and in good spirits in March. In April of 2018 was reportedly the last sighting of him alive. Did he reach Noble's camp but experience a major outage and was able to, take some time and rest? Did he, have that major outage and couldn't or didn't want to go on? Maybe he was ahead of schedule and wasn't ready to finish it yet. Maybe he didn't know what he would do once he did finish it, so he decided not to keep going. It could have been that he just needed some time to rest, but then he started feeling sick, or then he started having a depressive episode, and that's what got in the way of him finishing it. Like I said, maybe he started showing symptoms and started feeling ill sometime after April and until when he was discovered in July, where he had that rapid weight loss and, wasn't able to get help when he needed to, despite being in a relatively populated area of the trail. And then this leads to July of 2018. A few hikers had stated that they spotted his tent at Noble's camp in Ochope, Florida, but they didn't bother him when he didn't respond after calling out to him, thinking he was just tired. I don't think people necessarily assume someone is no longer alive when they run into them. They probably just assume that he was okay, but, he was likely dead for a couple of days before he was eventually discovered by Nicholas and Logan, at Noble's camp on the 23rd. And they, called an ambulance and authorities, and they determined that he had passed. And then in January of 2021, he was finally identified as Vance Rodriguez after exploring multiple avenues to try and identify him by circulating his story. So Mostly Harmless was identified after a former coworker saw an article with information about his case and reached out to the Collier County Sheriff's Office. They were already working on identifying Vance via forensic genealogy at the time, but they confirmed his identity with that information provided by his coworker, Marie. They identified him as Vance John Rodriguez, who was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in February of 1976. He had an older brother, a twin sister, and a very complicated, potentially abusive dynamic with his father, and which I believe led him to estrange himself from his family and distance himself from them. According to Marie, he told people that his father had deeply hurt him, although he never specified how. And, he did talk openly about a scar that was on his stomach. A lot of people that were interested in this case were interested in that scar specifically. So getting that, context, was really surprising to some people. And so, according to Marie, Vance had told people that the scar on his stomach had happened when he was 15. He decided that he wanted to end his life, and so he walked out into a field with a gun with the intention to harm himself or potentially end his life. And so he had shot himself in the stomach, but after he had done that, he decided that he wanted to live. As he was bleeding out, he flagged down a passing truck, as he was bleeding nearly to death. And, they took him to the hospital. He was able to get a couple of blood transfusions and surgeries, and they were able to save his life. According to his friends, that was something that he talked openly about. But, following that incident, he had said that his parents had institutionalized him, which I can understand kind of that logic. As a parent, if your teen, had done something pretty drastic like that, I think it is an appropriate step to seek out psychiatric resources and, maybe try to address those issues. Arguably, it should have been well before that too, but, that is clearly a sign that someone is suffering or struggling, potentially with mental issues. Vance had also said that he wanted to be eventually buried in that field that he had tried to end his life in. And I think there's just something very beautiful about that in a way, kind of recognizing the balance and the beauty of that, I think is important. And he seemed to have a renewed lease on life after that incident. He went out of his way to donate blood after that situation, knowing that it had saved his life. Following his near suicide attempt, his parents had placed him into psychiatric care. He had told many people that he was angry about this, and he petitioned for emancipation about a year after that, seemingly never looking back after it was granted. So as a teenager, 17, he emancipated from his parents' home. When his family had been contacted for comment after his identity was revealed to the public, they had stated that they had no comment, which personally I don't blame them for, given the notoriety of this case. But I don't think that implies any wrongdoing on their behalf. It could just be that they respect their privacy, but it could also, hint towards a strange dynamic. They had also just found out that Vance had passed away, and after at least a year of no contact with him, they maybe could have had more than that. Many people said that he didn't talk about his family or talk to his family and had cut off all contact with them. So I can't imagine, not speaking to somebody for, years and then finding out that they had passed away and, missed other significant things happening within the family. Apparently his grandfather had passed away, and he was listed in the obituary of his grandfather's passing, but they hadn't had contact with him. He had been estranged, and I know that's a very painful thing, so I can absolutely understand why they would want their privacy, their time, and their space to process that information, and also grieve the loss of Vance, who they may or may not have had a relationship with in that time. Randall Godso was Vance's college roommate, on and off for about 5 years. Other friends had said that they'd occasionally go out and party in college, but Vance was always a computer nerd. He spent a lot of time in the computer lab, and Randall had said that he would play for up to 18 hours a day while he was at home, kind of shutting everything else out and just focusing on gaming. And he had said that he also experienced huge bouts of depression. Vance would go a year without smiling or being nice to people. And, I have people in my life that are very much like that. They will kind of go through these bouts of, like a deeply depressive episode and just kind of lose interest in any of the positive things in life. And, that can be really difficult to have those types of people in your life that are suffering, but they, may or may not have interest in addressing that. Vance told him that he'd cut off all contact with his family, and, he was described as being depressed and moody his whole life, and never expressed any interest in, repairing that dynamic with his family. So I do hope that over time that had changed, but just kind of based on that information, it definitely sounds like he was still carrying a lot of hurt and anger in that, which makes sense. After attending University of Louisiana, where he went to school with Randall, he started working in e-commerce at Shopper's Choice in Baton Rouge. And he was known as a very talented and intricate coder. He was a senior architect and developer. The company's code base is still annotated with VR to this day. Marie, the coworker who I believe identified him, said that he would just sit down by himself, listen to music like Rage Against the Machine, and solve problems. He was very isolated in that. He would just kind of go for it and, work on his own to work things out. He got more comfortable as the problems became more complex, and I think that's probably one reason why he enjoyed being out on the trail, without a GPS or detailed trail maps. I think he was the type of person that really thrived on problem solving and had really great complex problem solving skills and liked being able to flex those muscles. I think he really enjoyed the challenge and those problem solving aspects to it. He did appear to suffer from mental health issues, but he did refuse conventional treatment. He would self-medicate with drinking and chocolate, and he would experience these outages where he'd become nearly catatonic, bedridden, and denying food or human contact, attempting to sleep until it was gone, and eventually he'd snap out of it. Marie described him as deeply kind and caring, but a bit of a dick, which, not gonna lie, I kind of relate to. So, he had these dynamics in his life with it seems, a good support network of friends who wanted to see him do well and thrive, and I think that's really important when dealing with mental health, but it also takes the person wanting to address these issues as well, and it doesn't seem like he necessarily wanted to dance with those demons at that time. He had a string of relationships that, were mostly described as toxic at best, potentially abusive at worst. He had a lot of strained relationships and dynamics with the women in his life, which could be a hint towards, how things were as a child. Many people who grow up in these dynamics continue that cycle of abuse, whether they mean to or not. And sometimes, they decide to pivot in a more positive direction and want better things for themselves in the relationships they find themselves in. But some people don't really have the resources to tackle that and to kind of stray away from what they know, right? So he started dating a woman in Baton Rouge. Their relationship lasted for over 4 years. I believe that they were both living in 2 different areas, and they decided to move to New York City together. She said that at first he was romantic and sweet, and then he started to clam up and shut her out, which, I think is kind of the case with people who are dealing with some tremendous trauma in their life. They have a hard time with those interpersonal relationships, and this is certainly no exception. They lived in a 500 square foot apartment in Brooklyn, and she said that he would just ignore her and refuse to talk to her or acknowledge her, which I can only imagine takes a tremendous amount of energy when you're sharing a small space like that, and that's got to be hurtful, to have somebody probably within arm's reach and not be able to actually talk to them or connect with them has got to be incredibly frustrating. He would get frustrated and he would act out when he was specifically frustrated with her. One time he had locked her outside of their apartment while she was naked during an argument that had started as she was getting out of the shower. Another time he locked her outside alone in the dark, knowing that that could trigger her PTSD, which was triggered by being outside alone in the dark. It definitely sounds like there were a lot of unhealthy things about that dynamic, especially toxic things. And, she said that he threatened to dox her if she left him. And, I'm not sure if that ended up happening. Maybe that's one of the reasons he felt the need to disconnect from technology and unplug was, maybe he doxed her. And that's why she felt like she needed to go by K, like the letter, rather than her name. Maybe something like that had happened. It definitely didn't seem like things ended on positive, amicable terms. It seems like Kay values her privacy, which is probably one reason why she goes by the letter K. I haven't seen her name in any publication. I don't necessarily feel like it's relevant. In doxing her, could definitely be a scary situation. They had met on a anonymous chat board. I believe it was for a game that they both enjoyed. But, threatening to dox her is definitely a situation that most people wouldn't appreciate or want to happen for them, especially for someone who seems to really value her privacy as well. She claimed that that was only the light stuff, that their dynamic definitely had aspects of, emotional and physical abuse. And, I do really feel for her in that situation. And if that is the case, I don't blame her for not wanting to be in that situation at all. He worked remotely for Shopper's Choice for a year after they moved to New York City. He then quit and lived off of his savings for another year or so. He registered for a company called VTech in 2014, and I believe he started that with a friend. But Kay had said that, he never really expressed any interest in travel, stating that, if she would say she wanted to go places, and he would say things like, we can just look at pictures of places online, we don't have to go there. His friends had also said that he liked to travel and go on walks, but never expressed interest in like long distance hiking per se. So it seems like maybe he had different versions of himself, or people had conflicting ideas of the things that he liked. And it could have just been that he was very private and, wanted to enjoy these things on his own, right? But maybe not with a partner. For instance, I like to travel. Sometimes I don't like having a person to travel with, it's the logistics involved in having another person there, or spending that amount of time with someone else, if you're introverted or an ambivert even, can be pretty draining for some people. So it could have just been that he liked travel, but he didn't necessarily want to travel with his partner, or he didn't want to travel with someone else, right? So it seems like he was definitely a very isolated person, and there's usually not really much harm in that. But when you have a partner that wants to go out and experience these things with you, and you're getting constantly shut down, I mean, that's got to be hurtful. So I can understand the frustration in that, or confusion in feeling like he didn't like those things, but all of a sudden he goes on this huge trip that seems so out of character for him. Kay had said that she felt that Vance got overwhelmed being in such a big city, surrounded by people that he couldn't connect with. So they broke up in the winter of 2016, and she decided to move out of their Brooklyn apartment probably sometime in December. In January, Vance had reached out to his old college roommate Randall, who said that he was worried that Vance might choose to end his life again. And, I could definitely see why that kind of crashing down, being in a new city, surrounded by people you don't really know, and having the one person you were there for not be there anymore, be a very troubling thing for somebody. There are a lot of people that say that he had a string of unsuccessful, toxic, or potentially abusive relationships. There was one previous girlfriend who referred to herself as Tuggy. I doubt that's her real name, but she had been quoted speaking with Jason Nark of Adventure Journal, that she stated she was 100% sure that Mostly Harmless was Vance. They had dated, I believe, in early 2000, I think around 2007, and they dated for a couple of years. She said that she wasn't surprised to hear that he left it all behind. She said he was very quiet, kind, and intelligent, and even though that they had parted ways and were no longer in contact, that she still loved him very much. And I think that can kind of show the complexity of Vance as a person, where he had these different dynamics that, some might have been toxic or abusive, but he also seemed to have a lot of love and appreciation for the people in his life. Even if he couldn't necessarily maintain those dynamics, it did seem like a lot of his more positive attributes of his character showed through. It can be hard for some people to maintain dynamics. It could be something where at first they're able to be charming and sweet, but as time goes on and things get more real, that it's too difficult to kind of maintain that same energy. And it could be that he didn't really have the tools to continue having a positive dynamic, or he got frustrated with himself. So I can understand that as well. In January of 2017, Vance, or Vajor, I'm not sure, posted in the Screeps Slack channel that he was mostly harmless for now. And in February, he had posted that he'll give you a reason not to like him. He had also stated on a conversation where somebody was looking for home remedies to cure a sore throat. He had said that he felt if he lost his voice that nobody would notice. His final post was in April of 2017. I assume this is because he decided to go out into the woods and unplug and decompress. He left his apartment behind with his ID, passport, cell phone, credit cards, computer equipment, gaming stuff, things that he probably really valued before heading out into the woods. Like I said, I'm not sure if he decided to go then in April or if he came back, spent a little bit more time in his home before heading out in June. But that's kind of how that situation led up to that. So these statements though that he would make in these gaming Slack channels really showed, I think, how he sees himself, or how he would acknowledge his struggles to maintain social relationships. So I can totally understand kind of that those feelings of negativity towards yourself, or the self-deprecating jokes that kind of hide some truth in them. His landlord had obtained a warrant to enter his Brooklyn apartment about 9 months later in January 2018 after not receiving rent payments for over 6 months. The landlord stated that there were many of his items, including the computer and gaming equipment that was there. He reached out to Kay, his ex-girlfriend, who lived there with him before, asking if she'd like to retrieve his items, but she didn't seem interested in doing that. Or really having anything to do with it. She said she had no idea where he was. The landlord didn't report this to the police. I assume it's, because he was probably a pretty consistent renter leading up to that, which might be why he waited 6 months. Usually tenants are served a pay or vacate notice. I believe it's 14 days in Brooklyn. But, that's before the official eviction proceedings would continue. From that point, it could have been that he had a month or two paid. Whether or not he was there is a different question. But it looks like, from what I can tell, the rent was paid until about June. And then, that's when maybe he was up for a renewal of a lease, or, he just stopped paying. Maybe it was something where he had an automatic payment system set up and something had changed, but for whatever reason he wasn't paying rent, and so those I believe eviction proceedings had started. His landlord was able to get that warrant to enter the home after over 6 months of non-payment, and was able to see that he was gone, and probably had been gone for a while. By then, though, he was already way south. By then, he was already gone. I know it's a competitive renter's market in Brooklyn. So, it could have been that he had a certain amount of time that had to be paid in advance to get into the place. And he just kind of let it run out and figured he'd either be back by then, or he would deal with it when he got back, or whatever. Or maybe he was hoping that by leaving that there that someone would know that he was gone, but it was months before that happened, and even then they didn't have a way to get in touch with him if he didn't have a phone. So I'm kind of curious to see what his mindset was, if he thought he would come back and be able to resolve that within those 2 months, or he just kept going, and he was like, well, I know I've already gone this far, I'll just figure it out when I get back. Or he was relying on things to be paid, right? Like maybe he had that automatic payment thing set up and that failed for whatever reason. So it was like he assumed that by the time he would get back, everything would still be paid for the whole time he was gone. Or maybe he didn't care. Maybe he was just saw it as material possessions and that he could just get more of it if he wanted to. I'm sure he made a decent amount of money working in the tech field. So it is interesting to kind of explore those different areas as well and see kind of what his mindset was upon leaving his home, right? And it could have been that, being there was a reminder of his ex-girlfriend, and he didn't want that reminder in his life, and he didn't care what happened. It could have been that, she was still on the lease, on the paperwork, so maybe he was like, well, screw her. She can deal with it, or this eviction can impact her, for leaving me. Who knows what his mindset was. Um, but, anyways, after the landlord had discovered he wasn't there, they didn't report it to the police. I don't necessarily think they're required to report that information. Personally, if I was the landlord and I saw that someone had clearly left in a hurry, I would be curious on why, and maybe would report that. But who knows, maybe they knew them very well or didn't care or whatever. I believe that he started his journey in April of 2017, but I don't think he actually started on the thru hike until June of 2017. So in April, he camped out at the Bear Mountain State Park for about 2 weeks, and there had been multiple sightings of him there, and he started using the trail name Denim while he was out there. But I believe that he had that 2 week trial run or, camping trip. And then he went back home because it appears that he paid rent until the June-ish mark. And then I think that is when he actually decided to start on the thru hike. And, he was going by Denim. There were a couple of sightings where people said that they had seen him, closer to the summertime, and he was using the name Denim and had said that he had started a couple weeks before. So that timing kind of lines up, and we'll kind of get into more detail on that later. But I believe he started his thru hike in June, even though he had gone on that separate trip where he was camping in the woods for about 2 weeks. And I think that was kind of meant to be a trial run for him. But the thru hike was, meant to go through, following those trails that all connect to each other. It does eventually end at the southernmost point of the continental U.S., which is in Key West, Florida. So it's quite a bit of a trek. So it seems like, maybe he had a little bit of time to prepare for it. But when it comes to, preparing for something like that, I think taking a couple of weeks to really get that all set up makes sense in my mind. But I could also see a situation where he was out there in April and then, was maybe camping for a little while. Maybe his rent was already paid for a couple of months, so he just kind of kept staying out there and then eventually started without going home as well. So I think there's a couple of possibilities there. So he either started in April or in June of 2017, right? And then he started heading south. Originally, he went by the trail name Denim, which I think was a bit of a clever nod that he may or may not have been super prepared for the hike, as he started, wearing jeans when he was hiking. And, if you're kind of out in the woods at that time of year, it doesn't seem like denim would be the ideal fabric that you would want to be wearing. I'd imagine there'd be chafing issues or overheating or some kind of thing, but I could also see why it would be a little uncomfortable to hike, especially a considerable distance in jeans. So Denim was his original trail name, and he had said after about 2 weeks that he changed it, but there are a couple of sightings that happen later on throughout the thru hike where he is going by Denim. So I don't know if that's a situation where the hikers that he ran into at the later time knew him from before, and so they knew him as Denim, or if he called himself Denim, or what, or maybe he just decided to switch it up and would go by Denim or Mostly Harmless or Bilemy, based on the situation or how comfortable he felt with people. Maybe he liked the idea of having a different identity, for different groups of people that he would interact with, and maybe he liked the anonymity of that and didn't really care to correct himself or keep it consistent, since there were a couple of different aliases or trail names that he went by. So I could totally see that as well. So this story reminds me of Lyle Stevick and Chris McCandless, partially because of the circumstances, partially because of the internet community coming together to identify them. But one of the things that makes me think of Chris McCandless is the fact that he seemed like someone that just wanted to get off the grid and kind of try his hand at being out in the wild, right? And he may or may not have been prepared for what was actually going to happen once he got out there, right? He didn't have a phone with him, he didn't have a GPS, he had a general map of these areas, and it seemed like there were multiple sightings of him with maps, but I didn't see too much that pointed towards him having detailed trail maps. But it seemed like he appreciated or sought out the challenge of being out there on his own with little help, right? He seems like somebody that was a, natural problem solver and enjoyed the challenge of solving those issues in a situation like almost like a game setting where you have these challenges that you have to overcome with obviously higher stakes involved. But when they had found him, the two hikers, Nicholas and Logan, had found him in Florida. They said that he was severely underweight. His weight was listed as 83 pounds, and he's someone that's 5'8". I'm 5'0", and I am 100 pounds. And his BMI, I went through and did a calculator for that based on his height. His BMI of 83 pounds, that's only a 12.6. And, underweight is anything under 18.5. So a healthy weight for him would be closer to 150 pounds, which is nearly double that amount. Did he have a illness that was quickly deteriorating his physical health? Or maybe he just, underestimated the amount of resources that might be available as the trail progressed. It is a really strenuous thing to be doing. There were some reports that he was hiking about 10 miles a day, and I'm not a hiker. I personally don't really understand the appeal, despite growing up in the Pacific Northwest. I've only hiked twice, once by accident. I recently went on a 7-mile walk and I was about done, and I think I went and sat down for the next 3 days. I couldn't imagine doing that kind of stretch for over a year of hiking at least 10 miles a day for a year. That is just crazy to me. But there are people who love that and who seek out those opportunities for adventure. That's just never going to be me. But they did estimate that he would be between 35 and 50 before he was identified. He was 42 when he had passed away, which I thought was really interesting given the significance of the number in the Hitchhiker's Guide. Mostly Harmless is believed to be a nod at the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. I believe it's the last chapter name in the book, Mostly Harmless. And so if he was 42, maybe he wanted to complete this thru hike by the time he was 43, right? The significance in the book of the number 42 is the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And maybe he wanted to do something like that when he was 42 to kind of give himself that extra nod. He seemed like a very clever person, and I could totally see why that number would hold significance given the significance in the book, Hitchhiker's Guide. But, when they found his body, they described it as, kind of twisted with his eyes open. And, it does make me worry that he had suffered a painful passing. And, you would never want that for anybody, but especially not when you're out in the woods, potentially alone. But that could have been something that he wanted. Maybe he wanted to kind of take charge of his health and, die with dignity. There are plenty of people who would rather be out in nature in a beautiful setting, doing something that they really enjoy, rather than sitting in a hospital room just waiting for death to come to them. I can totally understand that. But hopefully he didn't experience a painful passing, because that sounds quite uncomfortable and traumatic, to say the least. He was known to be an experienced hiker amongst the hiking community with good quality equipment. I feel like he kind of redeemed himself and built up that reputation, which is a far cry from the origins of Denim, right? Where he got this experience and, kind of learned the ropes and was able to adapt quite quickly. Maybe that tenacity, that drive, that problem solving is what kept him going despite his lack of experience. Maybe he was just so headstrong that he just wanted to tackle it, right? Maybe it was just another problem to solve. And, I feel like in a lot of ways he really adapted towards that and he really took on that challenge. You know, there was a point that was brought up, I want to say by John Lorden in his video, where a few hikers had said that they spotted his tent where he was found, but they didn't bother him when he didn't respond to them because they assumed that he was tired. They didn't necessarily think he might not be alive, right? Because it is a really tough stretch to be hiking, and I could see why you might not necessarily think someone is in trouble. There was a sign posted near the camp saying that there was a place to rest and to get some water. I don't know if that was a sign that he put up, like kind of in a Chris McCandless situation, or if that was just like a marker that was there already on the trail. But he was in an area that seemed to be decently populated. A couple of people came through in the days leading up to his discovery, and he was discovered in a pretty short amount of time. So I wonder if he chose that spot, if he felt weak or like he couldn't go on. He didn't have a cell phone with him. He didn't have other ways to, call for help, but maybe he thought this is a place where someone could potentially find me or help me, or at least they'll discover my body in a short amount of time. So I think that logic could definitely have been there. He didn't seem very interested in wanting to, sign in to logs or, have a traceable, path while he was going on this through hike. And like I said, he didn't bring his phone. There were Facebook groups, kind of along the way for hikers that wanted to get information on resources that were available along the way. But by not having his phone with him, he created some situations where, he wasn't as in the loop as other hikers, right? So there was a situation where he had said that he missed a supply drop, and he had asked somebody to comment on one of the Facebook pages on his behalf, asking them to leave a note for him since he didn't have a phone, right? He couldn't get updates on the Facebook page. And he was, hoping to get information on getting to the next trail point and getting to these, markers. But he didn't have those resources that a lot of people would have the technology to access, but he didn't because he didn't bring his phone with him. So there were a couple of situations like that where, he didn't seem like he was prepared as he could have been, but he seemed to adapt really well given the circumstances, and he made it quite far. I couldn't be able to do that, so I'm glad that he had at least stayed safe in a long stretch throughout the hike and, was able to really tackle that challenge with a lot of grace and handle that very well. There was a comment made by another hiker that several other hikers, quit during the difficult hike because of, feeling the physical toll on their body was too much. They experienced significant weight loss. Some people had said that they lost 40 to 50 pounds. Vance had lost half of his body weight, I'm assuming. And so I could totally see why that, hike would really take the life out of you. It's a lot. Many people became too weak or delirious to continue on that hike. So, when Vance had asked for directions to a hostel, it seems like he didn't have much luck getting to it without the technology and the resources that could have been available to him if he had those things with him. So here's what I think happened and why I think that. Again, I have no intention of accusing or, diagnosing anybody. I'm only offering my opinion, my theories based on the information and resources that are available to me. Um, he went alone, obviously. But why he went alone, I think, makes a big difference in terms of the context here. He could have done this for many reasons. Maybe it was a spontaneous trip. He was out in the woods for a couple weeks and decided he wanted to keep the party going. Maybe he didn't originally intend on continuing the hike, especially for a year. Maybe he started going and wanted to see how far he can go. Maybe he was too introverted and didn't want to spend that much time with somebody else, especially alone. Like, what do you even talk about for that long? Maybe he didn't feel like, he had other people in his social circle that would be able to or be interested in going out there with him for a unspecified amount of time. Maybe he needed that alone time and wanted to clear his head, be out in nature, and just kind of experience it unplugged. Maybe he was trying to find inspiration for his projects that he was working on. Somebody said that he was trying to invent lightweight hiking equipment that could track your hike, and another person said he was working on a hiking app. So maybe there was a couple things going on. He wrote a lot in his journal, the handwritten code for the programming game. So I think there was a lot of potential to be inspired out in nature, and he definitely seemed to take up that you know um and maybe he just started and planned to come back when he got tired, but then he never did. Maybe he just was energized by that experience and it helped him keep going. He had nearly $4,000 in his pocket and he worked for food and lodging along the way. So that seems like a likely scenario that he planned to come back. I think he just kind of wanted to have this wonderful experience and maybe reset and come back and start building those bridges after burning a lot of bridges in his life. I would like to think that he wanted to come back and to repair things with the people in his life, but he just tragically didn't have the opportunity to, and that's really unfortunate. He was known to be extremely friendly and kind, but quiet. He was trying to build a better community around himself, and after having dynamics that weren't so positive, maybe he wanted something good and wholesome in his life that he could maybe find inspiration to rebuild these dynamics in his life that weren't so positive. And maybe he felt like more of himself on the trail. His friends and former partners had said that he was able to be charming and kind and sweet in the first initial time of getting to know somebody, but after that he would struggle with that. And so maybe it was a relief for him to just like have these perfect like first impressions and then maybe never see someone again. And so I could see why that would appeal to him and kind of be this different version of himself to these strangers that he was meeting day in and day out along the trail, and then spending a lot of time by himself. Like, there is one thing that people who experience a lot of trauma in their life, they tend to isolate themselves because there's safety in isolation. You know yourself better than anyone else, but putting yourself in a situation where you have to trust another person with your own emotions or with your feelings, it's really challenging for some people, and some people just can't do that. Some people who have experienced a lot of trauma in life can eventually learn to love a pet, but really struggle to have dynamics with other people, or they eventually learn to love themselves, but the trust in other people just isn't there. And I think that there's a lot of those scenarios that could make sense for Vance in this situation. But I hope that's not the case. Maybe he just wanted to go outside for maybe the first time in his life, and he really enjoyed it, and he found a new appreciation for life by being out in nature and having that forced introspection. And just maybe he felt like more like himself, and he found something he really truly enjoys. And I hope that's more what it was rather than the darker stuff. Maybe he had that diagnosis before he left, and that's what prompted him to start hiking. Maybe he wanted to take better care of himself instead of eating once a day, pizza or lasagna. and then having a very like sedentary life outside of that, and isolated. Maybe he wanted to like go out and experience nature and try to take better charge of himself, and then it went too far, right? Maybe he was so obsessed with this like new year, new me kind of situation that it just kind of spiraled out of control and he went a little too far with it. So I think there's a lot of possibility with that too. He had commented, uh, you know, the mostly harmless comment in January, and this was months before he went out into the woods. So maybe he'd been considering this for a long time. His breakup happened right around New Year's. Maybe he was like, I've got to do something different. I've got to do something to better myself. And so he was like, I'm going to go on this hike. And so he started researching it and got excited about it, and then finally went in April or June or whenever. So I think there's a lot of possibilities in that he might have wanted something different for himself, but he wanted to come back, and I hope that he did. Honestly, the way that he had left his apartment in that state makes me think that he wanted to come back. But again, it could have been that he hadn't considered it, or that it just kind of kept going and he was too far into it at that point to turn back around or go home. Maybe he decided to start hiking and he kept going until he kept meeting these milestones, and that high was enough to keep him going for longer. Maybe he, started going further and further south and then decided to visit his sister wherever she is, in Sarasota or Fort Myers or whatever, but he didn't make it that far. Maybe he, like, wanted to rebuild that reputation and like redeem himself from his origins of denim, and that tenacity kept him going despite his failing health. I do find it interesting that his name, Ben Bilemy, it's a deviation from the typical spelling of Bellamy, right? Which is also the name of an actor that he might have been a fan of, but it's Ben Bilemy. It's Bilemy, and part of that name is bile, which makes me think it could be a hint towards whatever health condition he was going through. Vance seems like a really clever guy, and I wouldn't be surprised if that was a hint towards that. Um, you know, Kind of like in the Lyle Stevick case, where we don't know much about his life, but his alias that he decided to use was a hint towards that. Maybe he knew about the Lyle Stevick case and he found inspiration in that. So he decided to do something similar by picking an alias that was a hint towards a favorite book, or a trail name in this case that was a hint towards a favorite book. So I think there's a lot of possibilities to the actual name itself. Um, he might have been prepared for the actual logistics and finer details, like he started out in jeans at the beginning of his hike in June. He didn't seem to have a GPS. He had a huge, heavy pack. He wore knee braces. He went alone. But he also had good quality gear and seemed to adapt really quickly. And I think that, isn't surprising as someone who seemed to be a lifelong problem solver. I think he really thrived in that environment. Maybe he didn't want to be found, on more of a darker note. Maybe he wanted to spare his family the grief or the trouble. He didn't seem interested in wanting to log in or out of trail logs, but he did look at them. So I think he was interested of other people, just didn't want people to know about him. He was a pretty reclusive person, it seems, and maybe he enjoyed that part of it. He was listed on the ECT's class of 2018, and he logged in at the Wallace Center, but maybe he knew about this diagnosis and he wanted to end his life on his own terms. He maybe he didn't want to die in a hospital bed. Who does? Maybe he was hoping to be helped or discovered, but unfortunately it was too late, and he wasn't discovered in time. Maybe he wanted to die peacefully, surrounded by beautiful nature, and but he wanted to be discovered soon after his passing, so at least his body would be found. It's if he truly didn't care, he could have just wandered off somewhere in a swamp and, not in a big bright yellow tent near a place that people would probably see him. So I think there's a lot of possibilities to that. But, maybe he wasn't planning on dying there in the first place. Maybe he was planning to go right back home at the end of this. And, that's why he kept that $4,000 in his pocket unless things got really bad. And maybe he died of something totally unexpected. Maybe he lied about, having a diagnosis and he was perfectly healthy. And then something else happened to him where he died suddenly and, tragically short of the thing he set out to accomplish. And I think there's some real sadness in that thought. Maybe he didn't actually plan on dying and maybe he cursed himself by saying that. He like tempted fate. He was working for food and lodging, and I think it was to preserve that money in case he needed it to get home. He didn't, maybe he didn't find many resources in that area or became disoriented or ill. He might have been too weak and there weren't other hikers around at the time when he needed it. Several hikers had quit during this hike, because of the toll on their body, and they experienced significant weight loss. They became too weak or delirious to continue, and that might have been what happened to Vance. He asked for directions to a hostel. He had missed a supply drop, and he didn't have a lot of resources available to him without his phone. And that could have prevented some of these challenges that he faced while he was out there. He might have had a major outage and tried to sleep it off. Maybe he started feeling ill, which rendered him unable to seek help or continue on the path. He was reaching the end of his journey too, and it seemed to be a very positive experience for him. And maybe he realized he wasn't sure what the next steps would be after he finished. Maybe he would return home to a life and relationships that weren't as positive, and he didn't want that. Maybe he lacked the desire or energy to repair those relationships that he left behind. Did he lose the desire to go on, period? He might have felt like he was ahead of schedule, and so he decided to take some extra time to rest. It's really hot that time of year and muggy. There's a lot of bugs and snakes and creepy crawlies out. So maybe he just wanted to take some time to sit and enjoy nature, or, have some extra time to rest up before continuing on the last leg of his journey. He'd already made it, so far. He'd already come so far. On the flip side of that, maybe he felt like he needed to take the time because he wasn't keeping up the momentum that he had previously. He was hiking like 10 miles a day in extreme heat and a very humid climate that he wasn't necessarily familiar with. So maybe he saw that he was getting so exhausted that he needed to slow down. And, he might have been behind schedule, and that might have made him, lose a bit of his motivation, a bit of that momentum that had kept him going for so long, feeling like he was so close, but he wasn't quite there and he was still behind schedule is really disheartening, especially when you have a goal in mind. He had a goal in mind. He wanted to be completing this in July, and he was nearing the end of July, and he still had a significant amount of time left to hike. He was closer than he was months ago, but he was still behind schedule, and that might have caused him to fall into one of these episodes, or, lose motivation since he wasn't, meeting that deadline. Vance seems like somebody who was a bit of a perfectionist, and as a perfectionist myself, I definitely have had times where if I wasn't meeting a project deadline or it wasn't up to my standards that are very, very high, I'll just want to scrap it entirely. So maybe he was of that similar mindset where he wasn't meeting the, goals that he had set out for himself. He was potentially behind schedule, and maybe he just decided to call it quits and he lost motivation, or maybe he was just so sick at that point that he could not continue. or he needed to slow down, and that became discouraging to him, and that's what could have potentially led to him falling into one of these outages where he just, potentially became catatonic and, couldn't find the motivation to get up out of bed. So I think that there's definitely a lot of things to consider in that. So it could have been that he felt like he had the extra time, or maybe he felt like he was running out of time, or, he was going over what he had anticipated the deadline to be, and that caused him to become discouraged. And that can play a huge toll on your mental health, especially when you're, out there by yourself in really hot, muggy, miserable weather, and might already be battling those demons. There's a lot of really sad things about this, and like, we don't have those answers. I wish we had a little more perspective on his state of mind during all of this, but just kind of considering those factors, I think, can really help us understand where his mind was at the time. I've gone over a lot of things about this case, and I'm sure I've missed information, and I would love to hear if you guys have other information. Please put it down below. I would love to hear your guys' take on this. Do you think I might be onto something? Do you think I'm totally off base? I would love to hear it. This is just my theory based on the information that I've seen and, experiences of people in my life that remind me a lot of Vance. You know, kind of given all of that and taking everything into consideration, what lessons could we possibly learn from this case? True crime is a beautiful opportunity to, take these tragic situations and potentially help somebody, not have this situation come up, or, gain perspective that can really touch and, influence us and learn from this. Please hike with a partner, or at least bring emergency contact information with you, identifying information with you if you want to be found. John had mentioned on his video that this is commonly recommended to hikers, even if they go solo. Plenty of crazy things happen out in the woods. Be prepared for the worst, but hope for the best. Take your cell phone, or at the very least get a GPS that's equipped with emergency notifications, even if you don't have cell service. If you're injured or find yourself in a bind, you can send an emergency signal that is picked up via satellite, and you could potentially get help, even if you wouldn't otherwise have service. Some people don't realize, even if you don't have cell service, you still might be able to make an emergency phone call if you have your phone with you, because it overrides their system, so they can ping other cell towers for other carriers. So there is still the option to potentially get help, but at least bring a GPS with you that has some kind of emergency notification system. Vance said that he was thinking of inventing hiking gear that tracks your hike. Maybe that was part of it, where he wanted that safety feature built in as well. If he had the product he wanted to create with him, maybe that would have helped him. Since it was lightweight, it could have helped with fatigue. It could have helped him get help, since, he wanted to be off the grid without his cell phone. So there's a couple of different things. There are products out there for people who may not want to bring their cell phone with them, but there are ways to hike safely. And I feel like you hear so many stories of people really getting hurt, or not making it home from a hike, that makes you worry to go on a hike. Also, he was so close. He only had 250 miles after walking all of that, after hiking all of that time. It really breaks my heart that he wasn't able to finish and see it through. Vance seemed to have difficulties sustaining interpersonal relationships, and he probably had a lot of trauma that led him not to trust people enough to let his guard down or have them in his life. Maybe he was tired of doing that. Maybe he wanted to connect with other people and, make friends and build a community, start fresh. Maybe, after burning bridges for so long, he wanted to build some too. And, he probably saw this hike as the ultimate high-risk game, and completing missions and checkpoints, were a bit of a dopamine high for him, as, he was checking them off and solving these problems in real time, in real life. I could totally see the appeal as a gamer. I don't I also don't think that Vance felt like anyone was looking for him or cared. And that's a really sad thought because, when you're wrapped up in the throes of depression, these negative, intrusive thoughts can tend to creep up on you and really make you doubt, who your friends are, if people really care about you. And that's all negative stuff, but if you're someone that's just so consumed by these negative thoughts and you kind of are proven time and time again that these interpersonal relationships are, they don't last, or they're not positive and they're toxic dynamics, then I could see why he would just not care and want to leave it all behind and start over. Um, his friends assumed that he was in a major outage, but hoped and figured he'd come back when he was ready. Having that group of people around you that understand you, even when you're, dealing with these, mental health issues, is so important. And it sounds like he did have some people that were really rooting for him, even if they were from the sidelines. A former colleague at Shopper's Choice, the e-commerce company he worked at in Baton Rouge, David, had said that he was looking for Vance in 2017 so he could hire him to build an app for a client. He said he would have paid literally anything he asked for, but he was never able to find him. People loved Vance. People cared for him, and people wanted him to come back. And, I think in all of this, if one thing can be taken from it, there are always people that want you around. And even if, mental issues are making you feel as if that's not true, there will always be people looking for you. An entire community of people came together to try and find out who this person was. So many people were touched by this story and they wanted to help. They wanted to find him. And I think, like, if he could see that situation unfold, I really hope that if he went out there with the intention of not coming back, that might have changed his mind. I do think that tragically, and he just didn't have the opportunity. Another lesson that could be learned from this is always take the time to file a report with the proper authorities. There were multiple people in Vance's life that could have filed a report. Many of his friends were thinking that he might be off, having a exceptionally long outage where he just wasn't talking to people, and that was something that seemed pretty common for him. There's definitely a type of person that will go off the grid at times, but if it's something that's lasting months or years and you haven't heard from somebody, I don't necessarily see the harm in filing a report with the proper authorities. And they can look into it, they can investigate it. If the person is found and doesn't want to be contacted, they will tell the authorities that, and they can get that information back to people concerned. But when you just assume that things are okay and somebody, is waiting to be identified, like in this case, there were multiple people who had the opportunity to file a report but didn't. His information was up in NamUs pretty quickly, and that information was there available to the public. And if somebody had thought to file a report, he could have potentially been identified a while back, if people knew that was an option for them. So Vance carried around a lot of hurt and anger for most of his life, it seems, and that's gotta be exhausting. I'm glad that in the last stretch of his life he felt a sense of community and belonging and had friendships that developed among strangers. If I were a family or friend who, struggled to maintain that connection before, I would probably be a little heartbroken to hear that that side of himself was so present to strangers, and but not to the people actively trying to show him love in his life. And people are complex creatures, and I'm glad that his loved ones have some closure in knowing what happened to him and where he is, and that he was able to present that side to himself. but, it's got to be bittersweet. He was kind and friendly to strangers, and that's probably got to be a little frustrating too, to have someone like that in your life and to try everything you can to try and see that side of them more often and not be able to, and then have them cut off ties and go on to be this friendly person that you wanted them to be around strangers. That's got to be frustrating. And I have people in my life that are like that, where you're like, I know you have it in you, so why is it supposed to be like extra special that I see this like darker, moodier side of you when you could just be sweet back? It's frustrating, but there usually is a lot of trauma behind that. And I've been there, and it's tough when you love somebody, even in a platonic sense, and they don't allow themselves to be the version of themselves that that they can be. It's hard. It's really hard. But I'm so amazed and touched by the hiking community and the internet coming together for this case. I never felt like I understood the appeal of hiking. Like I said, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and I've literally hiked twice, once by accident. And seeing the community come together was really great. And, seeing everybody come together to solve this case and get his name back was so beautiful. And I enjoy hearing the experiences of hikers that they had their interactions with Vance. And I honestly even enjoyed hearing a bit about his life before that and seeing how he kind of went from this like dark, moody person to somebody who like seemed to be way more positive and like would wear bright colors and seemed to have this real zest for life and appreciation for it. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. I'm fascinated by these interactions, and even the trail names that he chose I think are really interesting. Like Denim was a clever nod to his lack of preparedness, and Mostly Harmless was probably a bit more fitting to his personality. Bilemy, I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I'm sure it's something clever, like I said. I think that they were all pretty fitting to his personality, or even hearing the trail names that other people use. There's got to be some story behind that, and that's something that kind of makes me want to go out there and hike and meet people. As somebody who stays inside a lot of the time, I would definitely, be curious to maybe try something new and go out there and see the world. I'm not going to hike like all of the US, but maybe a hike or two and every once in a while to, pay respects. He was known to be this friendly and sweet person out on the trail. And, he had this past life that was full of heartbreak and anger and unaddressed trauma. And he was really struggling with some mental health concerns. I hope he was able to make peace with them while he was out there. I hope he was able to pivot things in a more positive direction and in a way that gives me, and I'm sure other people, hope that you can, kind of find these new leases on life, and, you can have these really fun experiences, even if, you don't think you are able to based on your past. You can pivot things in a more positive direction and make a great impact on people while you have time to. And it's also kind of a grim reminder that sometimes we're not able to do everything we want to do in life. And I think that can also provide a lot of perspective and inspire people to go out there and do stuff and do things that they want to do. I hope he was able to make peace with the things that he was struggling with. I hope he was able to dance with his demons. Mostly Harmless is the name of the last chapter of the Hitchhiker's Guide. And maybe he intended for Mostly Harmless to be the last chapter of his life or experience. And you know what? In the end, I think he was right. It was mostly harmless. But I'm glad you got your name back, Vance, and I hope that you and your loved ones are able to find peace that you were seeking the whole time. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Vance's story. The Big Cypress, John Doe, Mostly Harmless, Bilemy, Denim, however you know him, or however he'd like to be known. I'm glad that he got his identity back. I hope you guys have a good day and that you learned something from this. Thanks for watching. Bye.